Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Hold My Drink, where we navigate the news and politics with a chaser of civility. I'm your host, Jen, inviting you to grab your favorite beverage, sit back, and imagine with us how to create a new American identity together. Welcome to this week's Hold My Drink and Counterweight podcast. I have got with me my co-hosts, W.F. Twyman Jr., who goes by Wink, David Bernstein, and today we have our guest, Wilfred Reilly. He is a political science professor at Kentucky State University. He's the author of the latest book called Taboo. And we're so excited. I'm so excited to be in this room of great thinkers. But, thinking while we're drinking, what is everyone bringing to the table today? Wilfred, did you bring anything?
Well, right now I'm just drinking a Diet Coke, but I'm also going to drink a Kentucky Bourbon Barrel Ale as the show goes on. So shout out to a Kentucky Bourbon Barrel Ale. My buddy's bringing a 6-pack of them over to my house. So I don't. Right now, I just have a pop.
Okay, all right. Well, we'll be looking for that ale. Wink, do you have anything?
Oh, I do. I'm going bland today. I'm having water, which is good for you. Water in my Yale cup, as you recall.
Yes.
So, yes.
Yep. And David, I know you're heading out. Anything for you?
No, actually, in honor of our very special guest, I brought Kentucky bourbon, Woodford Reserve Kentucky bourbon. So, cheers.
Cool.
Fine choice.
Well, I'm kind of embarrassed about my choice. I brought not one, but two watermelon White Claws. But my friends who have more discerning tastes look down their nose at my choice of malt beverage, and I know it's anyways. There we have it. That I got two of them, good. So because I'm excited about this conversation. So with that said, we've got a lot of things to discuss with you, Wilfred. David, take it away.
Okay, so we are in a very precarious ideological moment, and I'm wondering if you would describe how you would portray that ideological moment. What is the ideological climate? Maybe you could also talk about it on both the left and the right, and how you think the two are similar or dissimilar.
All right. I feel like we're in a time of attempted cultural revolution, and that's producing a pretty significant backlash. I think that'd be a fair way to sum up both sides of it. So, I mean, obviously, one of the greatest moments in U.S. history, and I don't think that's extensively disputed on the left or at least the mainstream right, was the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And of course, before that, anti-lynching legislation and so on. And many of the things that came out of that, I mean, the Civil Rights Act, voting rights for everyone, rights for women, something we often minimize as we talk back and forth, blacks, whites, Jewish Americans, whatever. You couldn't open up a checking account as a woman without your husband's permission until I believe 1979, something like that. So this came out of that 60s movement, even the drug culture, sexual revolution. So we had this massive systemic change in our society, private sector affirmative action. And right now, to a real extent, the debate is about whether we should extend that still further, beyond equal rights to, for example, a fully reparative structure of rights designed to compensate for harms that may have occurred in the past. The sociologist Ibram Kendi wants a Department of Equity, where you would look almost by profession at whether every racial and regional group is proportionally represented, and you would take legal steps to change that if that's not the case. Critical race theory as perhaps a replacement bedrock of education, or critical theory more broadly in the schools as versus what we have now. And a bunch of other things. I mean, I don't like the label defunding the police, but there's a considerable debate right now about whether we should change the nature of law enforcement, even the use of military force. So without just rambling on, there's a massive conversation right now about whether we need to go past the sort of baseline egalitarian idea of the civil rights movement to something else. And that's producing a pretty substantial backlash. Many people, including me on a lot of points, feel that much of what's argued by critical advocates, some of the people associated with the 1619 Project, for example, doesn't seem to be factually accurate. I mean, the famous claim there was that the Revolutionary War was fought in large part to preserve slavery, which isn't true. So this is a debate that's going on in letters. I mean, you'll have, John McWhorter and Dr. Kendi going back and forth with articles and so on. And also at the extremes, there are a very large number of people that feel like this is absurd. Like we are training people in the country to hate the country. And this tapers off to the alt-right and the fringes, where the idea is that there's an actual attempt to replace the traditional sort of white majority of the country. People use terms like genocide. I consider this nonsensical as well. But I mean, that's the debate that's currently going on. Do we need to extend the momentum of the civil rights movement to make massive changes in policing, education, law? And there's a considerable amount of resistance to this. To me, I think that in one sentence, the difference between the moment today and the civil rights era is that civil rights exist. So, I mean, prior to 1954, you had Jim Crow racial segregation, at least in the American South. So in 1954, with Brown v. Board, we desegregated. We essentially, at least in education and the like, banned this by law. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act made virtually all open racial discrimination civilly, sometimes criminally illegal. Since 1967, we've had pro-minority affirmative action throughout much of the business world, academia as well. So the question is now, do we need to do something else? Do we need to assume that every disparity is the result of discrimination and change society? And I would personally say no. There are obvious reasons for things like the police engaging more with young men, however un-PC that might be to say.
So we've seen a lot of this sort of concept creep where equity meant something at some point, now means something different, given Ibram X. Kendi's reinterpretation of the word. What do you tell an institution that has always struggled with the idea of equity, wants more equity, because equity sounds like a very benevolent idea, right? It's something that we all should stand for. What do you tell them about this particular definition of equity? What could go wrong if we just simply try to get more proportional representation?
Well, I think that what could go wrong is that the quality of the institution could drop dramatically depending on the reasons for the failure of proportional representation in the first place. So, I mean, women aren't proportionally represented among Navy SEALs or NFL players. And there are very obvious reasons for that. At the same time, men, especially, I don't see any of the guys on the panel being an excellent child psychologist, no offense. I mean, there are fields where men are dramatically underrepresented. You don't want a bunch of, big barking IQ 102 dudes doing certain things, therapeutic counseling and so on. So there are very often reasons, not that any of us happen to be big barking dumb guys. I'm just saying there are very often reasons for underrepresentation by field, and ignoring those in favor of equity can often become nonsensical. A bigger issue here, I think, is the differing use of words by the two sides. So racism to me, and I think to most people, would mean disliking most or all members of a particular race. That's a very simplistic but pretty accurate way to put it. Disliking people because of the race they are. I don't think I'd have a bigot in my home for something like a dinner party. If someone said, I don't like blacks or whites, and we need to stop this Hispanic immigration. That's racism to most people. What we're seeing now on much of the political left is an attempt to redefine the word racism to mean sort of any systemic entity that fails to produce exact proportional representation. So again, when you get into Ibram Kendi or Robin DiAngelo, Bell Hooks, Andrew Hacker, a lot of the writers, many of whom are intelligent, enjoyable people on this side of the fence, they'll very openly say this. So the argument is that any disparity in performance between different groups can only be due to two things. One is genetic inferiority, which I don't think anyone in the serious conversation wants to touch on. And the other one is racism. However hard it might be to find, there has to be some systemic, entrenched prejudice within the tests that has, whites finishing ahead of blacks, and in some years, blacks ahead of Latinos. I mean, so on down the line. Like there must be some form of prejudice there. The reality is that, it's sidelining a little bit, but the reality is that this isn't true. People like Thomas Sowell have pointed out for decades that there are important non-raced variables that also vary between people of different races. So, I mean, the one that I always use to open speeches is that the most common age for a black man is 27, and the most common age for a white man is 58. You can find that just by Googling modal average age for groups. So obviously, and the median's smaller than that, but it's still more than 10 years. So obviously, if person A is, say, 15 years older than person B, he'll have had a considerable amount more time to work and to accumulate resources and to build a family and so on down the line. So when you look at anything from crime rates to who performs most often as professional athletes to wealth held by families, this doesn't explain all of it, but you first have to note that these people are decades apart. And you move on from there to where people live, for example. Asians perform very well in this country, but Asian incomes are boosted by the fact that people of East Asian descent are concentrated in some of the coastal cities where you often find tech work, where you often find elite colleges. The reverse is true for African Americans. We're more likely to live in the South, the traditional Black Belt. So I would speculate there aren't very many income differences at all between Black and white people in rural Arkansas, but we are more likely to live there. You have to look at test scores, obviously, if we're being blunt. So when you adjust for all these things, you find that many of the gaps that are attributed initially to racism or perhaps to genes by the fringe right simply vanish. They disappear almost entirely. We see this with men and women as well. I mean, the claim is that the gender pay gap, quote unquote, is something like 59 cents. If you adjust for very basic things like are men and women working? Are they working in the same field? Have the women, the word I would use here is chosen, taken some time off to raise families in a way that men often don't? When you adjust for those things, you still see real sexism, which can't be excused, but the gap's 2 or 3%. So if you're claiming that any system that produces these kind of 2% disparate impacts is racist, you're using or if you're claiming that the initial 50% gap or 40% gap must be due to racism, you're using a very different definition of racism from what almost anyone is in the normal conversation. And I think the same thing is true with equity. Most people, equity is used so often because it's a very easy word to confuse with equality. So I think most people, when you think of equity, think, okay, do all the Black, white, Latino kids, if you're talking about varsity tryouts or a test for the gifted program, do they start on the same line? That's not generally what equity means. Equity would be more like, do they all finish at the same point?
Hmm.
So when people say there's not enough equity in the admissions program for Harvard University, they don't mean, let's say Yale, a better institution. Yeah. Although, anyway, I'm not going to get jokes. So I went to the University of Illinois, so like criticizing the Ivies from like that notch below is an old game among anyone in business. But anyway, but leaving all that aside, I mean, I don't think anyone feels that Yale University's admissions office is discriminating against, say, Black women, i.e., there's a desire to keep out Black women. There are no special programs for Black women, something like that. I'd say rather the reverse. And so would anyone who has any experience with higher education. What's meant by a lack of equity is that there aren't as many Black women proportionally as there are Asian men. So an equity program, if it's implemented, would mean we're going to push that number past 7% or whatever it should be by any means. And you can support that or you can oppose that, but that's very, very different from giving everyone an equal chance. And this actually sums up in better, shorter form, what I said earlier. We've been giving everyone, once you adjust for social class, a roughly equal chance since maybe the 1970s. That's not what's being asked now. What's being asked for now is enough of a boost to each underrepresented group to make everything equal in terms of results. There are some ethical arguments for this if you've read Randall Robinson and so on, but I oppose it. I think that there would be very practical negative effects.
Wilfred, you've done a wonderful job of capturing the nuance and complexity of the different factors at work. Singing to the choir here. My question is, why is there resistance to that plain nuance and complexity that you've so eloquently pointed out to us? Why is there resistance to that?
A good question. I mean, the short, glib answer is priests don't like it if you say God's not real. I mean, so there's a long running, and I'll make the challenge again. Myself and Coleman Hughes, a young academic who worked for the Manhattan Institute and now is doing his own thing, have both issued a challenge to Ibram Kendi to come have a friendly debate. We're both Black men. This would be one of the historically Black colleges. So I'll issue the challenge again. I believe it was Bob Woodson that put up $10,000 for the winner's charity. So if Dr. Kendi would like to come meet and have this conversation, have this debate, we're both very willing. I can't promise a specified amount of money on the table by this point, but I'm doing okay.
Right.
But every time I've issued this challenge, or someone like Coleman has, or Glenn Lowry has, I mean, very serious people, and Glenn Lowry teaches in an Ivy, well-known
Right.
academic.
Right.
There's been an immediate rejection. It's been, Dr. Kendi didn't say this, but it's been accompanied by statements like debate is the white man's tool, this sort of nonsense. And I think that the basic question of whether, for example, disparities are always due to discrimination has been answered. No, they're not. ADOS black folks can make a specific claim against this country on some grounds, but there are massive gaps between groups of every kind. I mean, if you look at US incomes, demographic incomes, this is on Wikipedia, it's on Britannica, the gap between the lowest and highest performing white group is around 500%. I believe the top white group is Ashkenazi Jews or Australian immigrants, and the bottom groups would be, without any mockery, but Appalachians, Cajuns, that kind of thing. So you're talking about the difference between maybe a $29,000 income and $150,000. It's very difficult to attribute that to racism or to say that Jews haven't suffered in the past or something like that. So this point itself isn't up for debate. But if you wrote a best-selling book with a title like Disparities Equal Discrimination or some such, you're probably not going to want to argue with the smart academic guy who's going to pull up all of the Cajun data. So in general, crits very often don't debate. When they do, it's sort of broad stuff. America has evil in its past that no one disagrees with. But yeah, I think the short answer is if you have a core set of ideas, you really love them, you don't necessarily want to argue about them and have them proven wrong.
I just asked one more question about this, and I'll turn it over to Wink. So one possible explanation for why we have critical social justice and critical race theory are so insistent on their own truthfulness and their own inviolability is that they're trying to crowd out other alternative arguments. And one of those alternative arguments is the role that culture plays in explaining disparities among people. By the way, it could be disparities among countries too, for example. I think that culture is extremely important in explaining why different groups of people behave differently. I mean, by definition, it explains who we are and why we behave differently. But I also understand the reluctance to give it too much a voice because in the wrong hands, it's an argument that can easily be turned into sort of a racist endeavor. You know, your culture is inferior to my culture, and so I understand why we're protective of it, but at the same time, I know it speaks the truth. How do you think of that? How do you balance out those if you have them dueling sensibilities as I do?
Well, I mean, I think as an adult gentleman, said in a somewhat mocking tone, but did seriously, you do have to be polite. There's things that people are discreet about in public forums, but still, the truth is the truth. The old line is the truth will out. You can't not say things that are true because what you do is wind up with an underground samizdat conversation where everyone secretly says the things that they know to be true. I mean, this is true over the years. I mean, it used to, without getting into a whole sideline here, I mean, it used to be considered kind of perverse and neurotic to say that women had orgasms. And there was all sort of response to this. I mean, from perfectly normal women being institutionalized to this underground of dirty French romance novels that went on for 100 years. Because the reality just was what it was. I mean, people could say whatever they wanted to in public, but people enjoy sexuality and so on down the line. And that never really changed. The percentage of people that were unfaithful in marriages was probably higher then than it was now. So it's the same thing with this. I mean, we can pretend that every gap between groups is due to some kind of weird form of racism. But, and again, there are specific groups, not all of whom, if you look at Appalachia, are minorities that have been obviously disadvantaged by the conflicts of the past in this country. I mean, if you ever gone to an Indian reservation, tends on average to be a fairly depressing place. Great people and the powwows and big events are fun, but day-to-day life on like the Crow Reservation in Montana is not exciting. I mean, so Native American Indians, even ahead of African Americans, Jewish Americans, the people that more often talk about this, have a pretty strong case against the country on some points. There's also a comeback, which is that the native tribes began about half the wars and lost them, and that is traditionally the wage of defeat. But I think that we're moving past that sort of barbarism, so there's a case to be made by that population group. Black Americans, the same thing. I mean, obviously, in the South, there wasn't residential racial integration until the 60s or beyond in some cities. I mentioned women. There are disadvantages in society that have to do with the impacts of the past. And I don't think anyone wants to distract from that. But there also is this bigger, more significant reality, I think, which is that you can literally look at 2 or 3 specific variables in the case of an individual person: aptitude test score, age, if you're looking at wealth, region where they choose to settle and live, grit, it's called in political science, as silly as that might sound. And let's throw in years of education. You don't have to trust the system, but you just get the sheepskin. That is going to matter. And you can use those 5 to predict almost anyone's income. So it's foolish to ignore these things. I mean, when you look at Black groups, the same pattern I described for white groups is very prevalent. One thing that's forgotten to a bizarre degree is that some of the most successful people in the country are African immigrants. So, I mean, if you go to that same listing of groups by income, I mean, it's above the average for the country, in the top 50. I'm not going to compare every white and Black and Asian group, but you've got Nigerians, Ghanaians, I believe West Indians, South Africans. South Africans do include some whites, but they're also 8th out of all the groups. I mean, these groups are doing well. Nigerians are the best educated group in the country. So there's obviously something that helps a Black man from South Africa or Nigeria who might get here speaking an almost patois version of English or another language altogether, who's an immigrant to this country, become one of the wealthiest people at the mean average level in the country that Black Americans could learn and benefit from as well. So I don't see that there's any gain to minimizing things that are obviously true. You know, talk about them politely, mention the past as well. But most people at some level are aware of this, that how well you do on the tests and how hard you work and so on is going to determine a great deal of your life. And you look like a fool if you just deny, you personally, but you look like a fool if you just deny that. If you say, well, no, there's some kind of hidden racism in math tests. And this is something people are arguing. The math SAT is culturally biased. We need to ban it. University of Washington just did. That's nonsensical. That's not going to close the math gap. It's just going to prevent people from seeing it.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Sure. So, one of the things I find fascinating is, even if you look within groups that are traditionally called Black Americans, there's such a wide range of experiences and perspectives and life stories. I've often thought that we do a disservice to the national discourse when we only think of Black Americans in terms of descendants of slavery. There were many Blacks, as you well know, that were free Blacks before the Civil War. There were Black colleges in the 1850s, right? I mean, there were Black lawyers in the antebellum era. There were Blacks who were making an epic institution at places like Spelman, Tuskegee, Morehouse, Howard, in the dark days of Jim Crow. Why is it, Wilfred, that we never see crits trumpet the likes of Mordecai Johnson or John Mercer Langston or Dean Kelly Miller or President John Hope of Morehouse? Wouldn't those be natural people to trumpet if you really, really care about uplifting the Black man?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I would add Robert Smalls, Madam
Sure.
Walker. I mean, yeah, all the giants. Yeah, of course.
Right.
I mean, no, and I think that most people from the Black community, especially I've noticed friends from middle or upper middle class Black families or from Southern Black families. I mean, many Black people are aware of these folks, and in a conversation among Blacks, this would be discussed at some length. And no excuses for these damn kids. Remember when Dunbar was Dunbar? I mean, my family is a.
You should come to a Twyman family reunion, just teasing.
Yeah. No, but it's all of this. Obviously, this is widely known to most. Again, any normal citizen with a Black buddy knows this. It's just one of those things you're not supposed to say. Just like
taboo.
Yeah. Oh, can't talk about it. You've got to stop. But no, I mean, it just when you look at a lot of these things, like, is biological sex real? Like, is there a way to tell a male from a female? I mean, even keeping it PG, you think about 15. I mean, the idea that this is something you're not supposed to talk about, it's a complicated, tricky subject, that's just a social taboo, as in, in the Maori Island states, you weren't supposed to walk up some hills. We all know the devil's not actually up there and someone's just protecting his coconut grove, but it's the rule. You just follow the rule most of the time as a taxpayer. So the same thing with, does IQ exist? The same thing with, was there great Black history? There's also very troubling Black history, of course. I mean,
yes.
Some people, Tom Sowell talks about this in Black Rednecks and White Liberals, for example, but I mean, there were, I believe, 7,000 Black slave owners. This obviously doesn't implicate the majority of Blacks any more than it does the majority of whites, but Native
right.
Yeah.
Good
But
point.
Native American Indians were legendary slaveholders. I mean, the Cherokee per capita, I believe, had more slaves than whites did. Jewish Americans are certainly implicated in the slave trade. And again, no anti-Semitism there. Blacks and natives had
Sure.
more slaves. But I mean, when you say something like, when you point this out, minorities owned X% of the slaves, many people today would simply assume you're lying. It doesn't fit the narrative. It's not part of the story. Again, when you move past Taboo and look empirically, there's not much debate about any of this. But why don't people talk about this sort of stuff, especially the good, especially the successes in our past?
Right.
I think the answer is because it doesn't fit the narrative. That's a cliche, but there's nothing a revolutionary hates more than a competent leader that wants to make moral changes to the system.
That is
This
so
is what,
insightful. That is so insightful.
but that's why communists hated Roosevelt. We often think of him as a bit of a socialist leader, but the Russians weren't any big fans of FDR or JFK,
Hmm.
as I recall my library, because the idea was that they were going to reform capitalism. The reality wasn't supposed to be, say, Kennedy letting Asians and blacks and Jews be capitalists too. It was supposed to be capitalism collapsing and becoming communism. That was the goal. So it's kind of the same thing with this. I mean, if black leaders were to point out, look, right now we're whatever it is, 12% behind in terms of average income. And there's certainly some white racism, but we could close that gap by probably 80%, probably 2 decades if we focused on boosting the test scores, fatherhood initiatives, that kind of thing. That wouldn't benefit someone whose actual goal is to replace much of the US system with something very different. That wouldn't necessitate a Department of Equity. So I don't think revolutionaries are in the business of suggesting quick fixes to the system.
It's so fascinating to me. I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, well, outside Richmond, and I can remember as a child going to my grandmother's house, and she would always make sure to have copies of Black Enterprise magazine, Ebony magazine, and I can't imagine in today's world Crips making sure their kids have copies of Black Enterprise magazine around the coffee table. So it's just a different. There's such a difference, I think, Wilfred, in generational divides within Black America. We tend to think of Black Americans as one collective, but it's so false. Even in my own family, I have a father who was born in the 1930s who never knew a white as a classmate in Virginia. I am of the age of the 1970s, the New South, desegregation in public schools. My daughter has never known a public school, only private schools, at best maybe 2 or 3% Black, now at Yale. And can you imagine the gap between the grandfather's experiences and the granddaughter? And I think we're not alone. I think that's true in many Black families, I think. And we don't talk about that because, as you say, it doesn't further the revolutionary imperative.
Yeah, I think, and I will note, I haven't done the full post-institutional review board version of this. This has been through classes and that kind of thing. But I've actually had a pretty good number of people take the scale of privilege that was designed by, I believe, some kind of Ivy grad students, and that led the BuzzFeed website for weeks. You can find it just by Googling "check your privilege." Something like 500,000 people have taken it. I've had people take that, and I've actually been interested enough to look at what predicts the results, i.e., what are the things that are more likely to make you quote unquote privileged. And what I find is that with everything else adjusted for, again, just as with women, there is that 2 or 3% effective raise. But there are a whole bunch of things that contribute to your privilege far more on average, and assuming privilege is a serious concept.
Right.
But number one is just social class. So if the difference between a black guy and a white guy, with everything else set at the median, is, I believe it was 46 versus 49, the difference between a rich guy and a poor guy is about 80 to 12. I mean, the majority of privilege is just objectively social class. When you ask questions like, have you ever lost a fight to more than 2 people? Like, have you been jumped? Have you ever gone to bed hungry? I have, actually. Have you ever gone to bed hungry? Have you ever had an internship? It's one of those odd little tests of whether you're in the upper middle class. Yeah. Like, you can't, in a regular working family, you can't just take a job for no money and work it for 6 months. So, I mean, if you ask those questions, again, the impact of class is more than 10 times, let's say, the impact of race. And then again, there's the impact of gender. You know, when you ask questions, have you been the victim of domestic violence, that kind of thing. Although guys are coming up on that one. The gap is closing. But I mean, just so on down the line, religion plays a role. Atheists take a fair amount of abuse, in particular in high school and early in college. I was surprised to see that. Region, urban, rural. Being from a small rural town is a big disadvantage no one ever talks about. When we talk about food deserts, I mean, when I go hunting or fishing in Kentucky, you'll go through cities that are pleasant looking little places, but have two businesses in the whole city, and the next actual grocery store, not the ever present Dollar General, is 2 towns away. I mean, so that is a source of disadvantage. Anyway, the point of all this is, yeah, there are a lot of things beyond race that affect how you're going to perceive life or how you're going to deal with others during life. Someone can say that, my focus is race, my focus is uplifting Black people. There's nothing wrong with that. But even for that person, you have to realize that it would be just nonsensical to say that you or I, for example, but Barack Obama, a whole bunch of Black people are more disadvantaged than a 4'10" Appalachian grandmother in the Ozarks. That doesn't make any sense. And a lot of people often slide over to that, into it or very close to it. I believe The Onion recently ran a joking article headline, LeBron James pulls over to lecture white bum about privilege. But that's because that sort of thing happens so often. And for example, top 50 college classes, the professor who has a tenured chair, makes $200,000 a year, is talking to some kid whose dad was a coal miner about the benefits of being white. The short form is, yes, many things affect who you are and how you'll be seen and how much you'll enjoy life.
Is there a disconnect increasingly between the reality of the critical movement and the reality lived on the ground for most Americans? And if there is a disconnect, doesn't that foretell the rise and fall of critical race theory?
Well, I think there actually is a very interesting question here. I feel that critical race theory is confined to one very specific sector of society, at least in terms of where it's taken seriously. And that sector tends to be the very urban, kind of upper middle to upper class, college educated, mostly coastal. Even in Chicago, where people are a little hesitant about this sort of thing in the prep schools and so on, it's this one very small group of people. And I mean, when people talk about sort of the existence of a national elite, I mean, that's a thing that obviously is real. I mean, I joke about being at the lower end of the elite because I'm from Chicago and Louisville, not New York and Boston. But that joke implies its existence. I mean, there's a single group of people from perhaps 200 universities, some of which actually include some of the historically Black colleges. We're talking about Howard and Morehouse. But I mean, there's a group of people from less than 300 schools, maybe 20 cities, fairly common set of center left to center right policy perspectives that actually run the country. And very often people from Donald Trump to Louis Farrakhan will run into this buzzsaw and just be absolutely amazed. Who are these folks? I never met them where I grew up. It's a thing that exists. And I think that's where the left side of that is where CRT is taken seriously. And I will say, it's fun to make jokes about the elite or the demographic breakdowns of the USA, but there's actually some interesting social science here in that if you are a Harvard student who is obviously pretty high IQ, I'm sure fairly good looking by conventional standards, and 5 gyms on campus, they might be a little professionally disheveled, but almost everyone is physically fit. Almost everyone has income. Many people are from that trust fund sector. What are the things that could actually cause you to feel disadvantaged? And it's a very short list that begins with race, that would go into gender, and that would then go into sexuality, I think, which is why at the elite colleges you have so much of this stuff. I'm a non-binary woman-identified person who also identifies as polysexual. I asked one of my young mentees, a guy named Montayette, what all this stuff means once. I mean, so he said that his girlfriend, without going into all his personal details, he said that a close friend was pan and polysexual. And I asked, how does that just not mean bi? Which hasn't been a unique thing among high school or college women for quite a while. And his explanation was like, well, you got to understand, big bro, there are more than 2 genders and sexes. This means you're comfortable with all of them. And it was all this sort of stuff. And I think that where you're identifying as, a pan polysexual, happily promiscuous, etc., like you're probably facing very few other struggles.
I mean, good point.
Yeah. So at any rate, that's where CRT has a big impact. When you start getting out into people of different social classes or people that have come here from, say, Israel or South Africa and actually experienced real racial and class social group conflict, this sort of thing, I think people take it much less seriously.
Well said. Jen, jump in. I don't
Well,
want to.
I was just thinking though. I'm thinking about you, Wink, because obviously you and I know each other quite well.
We get along very well, as it's evident.
We're working on a book together, Wilfred. But you said something about generations, and I think that we see, and I think you've also seen. And Wilfred, you said that there's only a small group of people who really buy into this ideology, but it's a very loud group of people. And I think that even Wink and his family sees that those differences in ideology and how it's impressing upon his family. For me in particular, where I've seen the tension the most in the loud voices and where it pertains to our differences is in the police story. As I mentioned before, my husband is in law enforcement. He has been for a long time. And when you hear stories like, let's say Michelle Obama recently just came out and said that she's worried about her daughters getting in the car every day. I mean, I don't even know what to say to something like that. I mean, first of all, let's just talk about how the fact that you've got Secret Service for the rest of your life. But that aside, that kind of stuff is shocking to me. I mean, another story just out today, the Pennsylvania governor was talking about how everyone should be afraid of the police. And so you have this narrative that, and you've written in your book very extensively how false this narrative is. And yet we have governors, former, first ladies talking about this. And so even if it is among a small group of people, it's a very loud, vocal group of people. And it is affecting everyday life. It is affecting everyday life.
Oh yeah, that actually is an excellent point and a corrective. I mean, yeah, the nonsense the elite believes. I mean, this is just as with the comment about women earlier that led to a lot of people being institutionalized. Like the elite can believe crazy things that affect the rest of us. Yeah, no. So I think that is valid. I think you're going to see. So I guess what I'm saying here, I don't see CRT or wokeness being a major culture penetrating threat to some extent. In the way that a foreign war requiring the drafting of men across groups or something like that might be, because I think a lot of people simply reject it. Some of the most hilarious conversations I've ever seen involve people trying to explain white privilege here in Appalachia. I mean, just sort of like, well, you mean it, and I don't mean to make fun of anyone's accent, but well, you mean it would, so you're saying we have more money or there's less crime? What exactly are the results of this privilege? And it's just really, really, really funny. And the majority of like working class Caucasian schools in Appalachia are not going to adopt the CRT curriculum. Some of them, in fact, have been annoyed enough by the proposal of a CRT curriculum that they're working on a labor history curriculum, which is something that's been almost totally forgotten. The integrated white, black, native, everything else struggle against kind of the boss men in the 1920s and 30s, which killed tens of thousands of people, probably without exaggerating, in this region of the country, Red Robins and all that. But I mean, so I do think that a lot of people view this as an elite regional conversation. A lot of people are going to reject it. But yeah, to the extent that it gets into, I think the place of primary conflict will be a lot of just very mundane middle class suburbs, which to some extent, that is a large amount of the country, in some ways the backbone of the country. I think that's where you're going to get a group of people that don't know what the modern hip version of these words like equity mean, going up against people that are trying to say this feels a little off to me, and like those school boards are gonna have some real conversations about this. So yeah, it's I don't really have a penetrating point here. I think it's a problem. I think the how much of a problem it is kind of limited in scope, because so many Americans, from the black elite to working class white guys to the cowboy culture out west, are just going to look at this once and reject it. I mean, a lot of these ideas seem objectively nutty to most people. Like, yeah, no, go on here.
I was going to say, I was just going to interject to say, although today, literally today, they are voting on, or at least having a discussion, I don't know if voting is the right word, on whether or not to adopt objective math in California curriculum.
Right. As opposed to what though?
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's the good question. But where
2 plus 2 equals 5. Power to the people, right?
Because getting the right answer
16, 19.
might be racist.
Right.
But I mean, they're literally. I'm on calls about this whole week. Today is the day in California that they are. Again, it might not be voting. They're having at least a discussion, if not a vote, on whether to adopt this new curriculum. And so what worries me is I do agree with you, because then you also see places like Idaho going, screw this, like we're not bringing this in.
2 plus 2 equals 5 has never built a toaster. That's the one argument
David, too much reality, David. Too much reality.
Right.
Maybe.
David made a very important point, though. I mean, when I talk seriously about philosophy, leaving aside, the Altis v. CRT online debates, if I was working on a paper or something like that, I actually would identify as a modernist, not pre or post. I think that with Einsteinian physics and modern mathematics and so on, I mean, we really did discover a substantial amount of truth. Perhaps these UFOs that I'm hearing about will, tell us some new secrets near future, but we really do know how to build things, how to build toasters that can do the equivalent of baking bread in 30 seconds and send spaceships to other planets and so on. So to some extent, that to me is the demonstrative evidence. We don't need to have all these nonsensical conversations. You just can point to the stove that's making the room 500 degrees and say, well, that works, doesn't it? But yeah, there really is an argument almost against objective reality when you get into some of this stuff, like the arguments against math, the argument that people with vaginas aren't necessarily female, the argument that you can call them races or not as you prefer, but the human background characteristics being West African and so on almost don't exist. They blend seamlessly into one another. IQ is not real, and Islam is the most peaceful of religions. I mean, there's a lot of this stuff that's just objectively crazy. The real question is whether people will be cowed enough by it or unaware enough of what it is to allow the objective nonsense to prevail. And I guess actually I have a positive attitude here. I don't think so in the majority of states. This is like the mask mandate debates and so on that you're seeing right now. There's very much an attempt to insert sort of current elite culture into a bunch of places like Texas high school football practice, and people are just like, nah, Hoss. That's where it stops. So hopefully there'll be a lot of that as we see CRT trying to spread.
Hey, I love the optimism. I consider myself optimistic too. And every time I hear a story of optimism, though, it's always countered with a story. Like I said, I mean, you've got Michelle Obama's, you've got governors pushing for this stuff. You've got this going in through our school. I'm going to give you an example, though, going back to, because a lot of my examples are on the discussion of police and policing in America right now. But this is a recent example of mine. So about it was before Trump, Obama was still in office, and we had that shooting of several Dallas cops. It was about 6 years ago. You might remember what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
Anyways, there was 7 or 8 cops shot, and at that time, my husband, being law enforcement, ended up putting out a blue line flag in support of his comrade, whatever. And we just ended up keeping it up for indefinitely. We have an American flag out. We cut that flag out. Didn't think much about it. But it became slowly more politicized as then Trump came into office. And so that was seen. And then you saw a lot of supporters using that flag. And so it became political. When we originally put it out, it had no such connotation. So I live in Austin, Texas, which is a little blue bubble. And I live in a very liberal neighborhood that's near the University of Texas. And we live in a historic district. And our house was chosen one year to be a part of a historic homes tour. And so I told the people, that's fine, but our flag, knowing at this point the flag had taken on different meaning, I said, just so you know, those flags are there to stay. And they were like, oh, we don't care, whatever. But sure enough, someone stopped by the home tour and said, I don't feel safe having you in my neighborhood.
That's hilarious.
That's the first thing. Second thing, then this is years later. So that was a couple of years ago. Years later, though, a friend of mine is part of the home association. And she was telling me, she goes, we've been asked by this same person to apologize for having your home on the homes tour because you had the blue flag light out. And so it's like this person, I don't know this person. I said, I have a podcast invite her on. Like, let's have this conversation. I want to have this conversation. I want to hear your voice. But I mean, that's how much it is. I've seen this infiltrate, from Michelle Obama, Pennsylvania governors, our children, to everyday life where someone feels threatened because my husband's in law enforcement and because of a flag.
And let me jump in, if I might, Jen. And I know an example from personal knowledge. There was a Blue Lives Matter rally or protest in San Diego. And I won't mention names, but someone I know was a babysitter for little kids, maybe 10 years old. And when they drove past the rally, she said to the little kids, um, you know, those are white supremacists. And one of the parents, tried to correct her and say, you can't engage in stereotypes. You can't caricature people, right? We don't know about individuals in that protest. And that led to a quite disharmonious evening in that household and ruptured feelings for a few days. So I just want to chime in with Jen's observation is that there are these differences of opinion. And how do people who are anti-dogmatic live in households and families where other members may be very dogmatic? It's an interesting question.
It is an interesting question. And yeah, I mean, so to clarify, to the extent that this kind of nonsense is out in public, is launching conversations, is causing fights in the burbs and so on, it is an unnecessary negative. I think that one of my suggestions in terms of how to resolve conflict at this level is almost always just to present the truth. And I think this is a good example of a situation where this can be done. And I think that's why at the local level, people like James Lindsay or Catherine Borshenko are going to have pretty good success at blocking these district-wide CRT initiatives. One of the things that I find is that in a weird contrast to the 1980s perception of kind of fake news or bad science, leftists in America right now seem to believe a lot more nonsense than people on the right or on the center do. And it's measurable. Like the Skeptic Research Center recently did this large end study, something like 1,000 people, where they asked people, how many unarmed black men do you think on an annual basis are killed by the police? Unarmed black men.
What's hundreds of thousands, right?
It was the average. So among people that identified as very liberal, just to say just regular leftists, the 35% of them thought the number was about 1,000. Another 15% thought it was about 10,000. And then 7% thought it was more than that. I didn't break down the averages myself, but it would have had to be like 4,000 or 5,000 brothers that they think are killed in a typical year. And if you go over to regular liberals, just mainstream Americans, the people that are complaining about Blue Lives Matter flags, it was 26% of them thought it was about 1,000, and then 6% thought it was 10,000, and 6% thought it was more than that. So, and this goes on into a lot of things. I mean, like Bill Maher had a great routine about this where he talked to his mostly liberal audience about COVID. And he said, well, I mean, statistically, about half of you think that if you get COVID, you have a 50% chance of going to the hospital, if not dying. In reality, your chance is like 1%. Like COVID's a serious disease, but the death rate for COVID is well under 1%. The hospitalization rate is like twice that. So I think that very often when you're talking to these people that are panicked, that have actually been watching just wall to wall MSNBC and CNN and listening to NPR and going to these neighbors meetings where you talk about how either the white supremacists or the urban riots can strike anywhere.
Right.
I mean, it's useful just to point out what the actual numbers are and say, nah, bro, that's not true. That's not a thing that's going to happen. But yes, to the extent that ordinary communities have to deal with this, it is problematic.
Well, I mean, I think one of the answers, Wink and I would probably just love to have keep your book around with us and be like, here's some numbers. Here, read this.
Here's a number for you, Jen and Wilfred. I was curious on my walk this morning. I usually walk before our podcast, and I thought to myself, there are over 40 million Black Americans. Well, that means there are over 40 million different life stories, experiences, and perspectives. And so I thought to myself, how long does it really take to understand someone, their story? Let's say an hour. if I don't spend an hour with Wilfred, as I am doing today, I cannot get a good sense of what Wilfred's all about. So if you multiply an hour times over 40 million Black Americans, how long would it take a researcher to really understand the Black American experience, which is comprised of over 40 million Black people? You would spend over 10 years of study before you were able to spend an hour with each individual Black American. So that's why I think we are so vulnerable to caricatures and stereotypes. The human mind isn't capable of doing that kind of nuance and complexity. We might even have computer programs that can do that. So we latch upon, as you mentioned, slogans, things that are easy to get a handle on and to interpret. And it makes our life easier. But the problem is, the easier the slogan goes down, the further distance you are from the aggregate reality of over 40 million Black Americans. And so that's why I think it's always important to, if you can, never engage in slogans. Ask a person to use another word. Don't use privilege. What are you actually talking about? Never be an avatar for caricatures or stereotypes yourself in your personal life. And never choose the mask of a caricature for private gain and profit. I think if you can do those three things, you're closer towards living an authentic life. And as James Lindsay has told us, authenticity is like kryptonite to woke theory. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely some excellent lines and ideas in there. Never be an avatar or caricature of yourself is
Right.
an excellent. That actually is an excellent philosophy of life, I think, for most people. Yeah, I think a lot of this would apply not just to wokeness, but to fanatical ideas overall.
Mm.
I.e., when you respond, don't respond by saying, I view you as an enemy, I hate everything that you're saying, logical or not. Ask them to define and clarify what it is that they're actually talking about.
Right.
And I mean, definitely, I don't know if I'm the guy I'd always pick, but there are a huge number of elite social scientists and so on, thinkers, philosophers that you can cite as you do this. From John McWhorter over to Tom Sowell, over to people that actually research, the biological differences between, say, men and women. Like, there's a great deal of reality there. So if someone says, I think all whites have privilege, ask them, as you said, what privilege means. Do you mean that they have more money? Do you mean that they experience less crime or violence, or that they have a lower rate of suicide, or that they use drugs less often? I think, and it's not a race, but I think whites are ahead of blacks in 3 of those 5. So it's just sort of, what do you mean? Well, I mean that they can feel, no, but what does that mean? And this is a good way to unpack. I actually once got a priest to start screaming profanities at me by just asking him questions like, what is sin? All this other stuff. What are you talking about? Well, there's certain things like abortion that are just bad. I don't even disagree with you, but isn't the greatest sin pride? Why don't we ban that? And at the end, it was just like, get out of here. I don't have time to argue with a secular lawyer. Your soul's to say. But I mean, it's much the same thing with the woke stuff. What are you talking about? I think numbers play a big role there. And a lot of this is just, instead of, getting on your knees and giving the pledge or whatever, just sort of each time you hear this stuff, unpacking it logically. I know I'm being a little repetitious here, but like the Michelle Obama thing, as I understand, if you are a direct intimate of the president, like you're the first lady or the first daughter, you get Secret Service protection for most of your life. So if someone said that, you would just ask, well, wouldn't the 2 assassins in the next car be able to get out and stop this local traffic stop? No, obviously that's not their only role, great brave officers and stuff. But like, don't you think the car full of Secret Service people would be able to prevent the, I don't know, that's Secret Service rolling off. But anyway, the point is, don't you think that this car full of federal officers could stop a local highway patrolman from giving you a ticket? And very, very often, the question is this open and this obvious, and I encourage people to ask it. And to the extent people are intimidated and don't, more and more nonsense becomes part of the everyday normal discourse.
Yes.
The reality is that a lot of this stuff just isn't true.
But there is that intimidation because, of course, no one wants to be called the ugly names in public spaces like the Twitters and whatnot. And so people just be quiet, they shut down. But one of the things that I think you said earlier, and to bring it back almost to the beginning, is we're using words differently. I mean, just the other day I was having a conversation with a very good friend of mine who has a completely different worldview, but we're very deliberate in trying to maintain our friendship despite that. And I realized she was using the word racism differently than me.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were fighting, not really fighting, but we were disagreeing on something, and it came up later that I was like, oh, well, that's not what I'm like. I still don't agree with you, but you were using a different word. And that's the same with equity and equality that we talked about earlier too. I mean, people are equating those two things, and they're two different things. And so part of it is just we're talking it across each other, not just because we have different ideologies, but because we actually have different language.
There are about 30 slogan words out there nowadays. And I always tell Jen, why don't we put those slogan words aside and use the other 300,000 words in the English language, right? So, for example, I don't use the word racism or racist because I just think it's imprecise and it was popularized for political purposes by Leon Trotsky. I prefer to use prejudice because that's what you really mean. That's what I mean. And I think when you do that, you are able to more closely align your conversation with each other. So don't say racist, say prejudiced. Don't say privilege, say the fruits and the abundance of your hard labor or ambition or whatever.
You just say rich for
you
most.
Can say rich.
Most
That's true.
Privilege.
That's true. That's true. So I think was someone, I won't mention the name, but a very prominent commentator gave me such a great piece of advice. He said that whenever someone tries to manipulate language to win an argument or to dominate you in a conversation, simply say, I don't engage bullies. And I have found that simple advice works wonders. I wrote a newspaper article maybe 3 or 4 years ago about a dispute between me and my lovely daughter, who I love. But we are related to George Washington. And to me, that's a great big deal. To my daughter, this was something to almost be ashamed of. So we had a big fight in our household about whether or not we could put a picture of George Washington on the wall. But in my article, I proudly professed my reverence and appreciation for George Washington to my daughter's consternation. And there were only a few people who were aggressive or hostile, but I told each of them, sorry, I don't engage bullies. And that was it. Click. If you keep your mind bully free, then you let into your mind only those who are receptive to constructive conversation. And that's worked for me.
Yeah, no, I think that you could almost break this down into kind of a logical or strategic framework when it comes to talking about this and other issues. I mean, first, if you're in a serious debate style conversation, ask people to define their terms.
Yes.
Most people, and that used to be something that is associated with, for example, high school debate. It's kind of silly to see people doing that at cocktail parties and so on, but it's an important first step if you feel people might be acting in bad faith or if you're just using different terms. So when I say racist, I do still sometimes say racist, or when any prejudice, anything of that kind, I'm not assuming that the person I'm talking to means any system that sometimes produces inequality. So it's very important that if we're going to discuss whether something is racist, we first clarify what's even meant by that. And then second, I guess the next step would be to look and see whether there are facts that back up each position. So first, what are you talking about? Second, do the facts support it? If you're arguing that Appalachian whites are more privileged than Black Americans, what's the average income for Black Americans versus Appalachian whites? It turns out that if you're looking at 2-parent families, for example, I think we're $20,000 in the lead, which would seem a point of pride for Black people, but it would also seem to be something that indicates we need to help out, that region of the country. We all share the land together. So that's point 2. What do the facts say? And I guess point 3, I agree with you. If someone says, well, you're just saying that because you're a Nazi. I mean, I don't really see much reason to continue the conversation. So yeah, just saying I don't engage with bullies or bigots or whatever term you choose to use, idiots, is a pretty good way of getting out of that situation. On Twitter and similar social media, I just block people unless they're close friends of mine.
There you go.
Yeah, if anyone comments and says something like, you're just predatory Uncle Tom from the business world, and
That's
let me
right, that's
tell
right.
you why I hate you. It's like, why on earth would I listen to why you hate me? I don't know. You're just Adam and Eve. So I immediately hit the block or the mute button, and that's it. That's the end of the conversation.
And it's healthy. It's good for you.
Well, I've
And good
learned
for-
that from you, Wink. It's so funny, Wilfred. We put, Wink and I write together, and every now and then we put what we write, out in the public space. And every time we get something negative, I furiously text or email Wink, and he's like, he gets almost mad at me. He's like, "Stop telling me about bullies." So he's
Yeah,
very
I
sincere
don't
about-
engage bullies. You got to be zen.
Yeah.
I don't engage bullies. I don't engage.
Oh,
We have to model good citizenship, I think. We have to model good civic discourse. We have to be, not to paraphrase a cliche, but we have to, in a sense, live our lives as if we would want others to treat us. We treat others as we want others to treat us, and vice versa. We always have to try to take the larger view of things. I think I wrote somewhere that the universal transcends everything. The tribal transcends nothing, and I think there's a lot to be said about that. That too many people fall into the tribal trap of groupthink and herdthink and critical race theory because it's comforting, right? It takes less mental energy to just go along to get along. But I think for those few who can see when slogans are being used with imprecision, when there are those who can see that the world is larger than Black Americans. I mean, Black Americans are only half of 1% of the world's population. Think about that. Half of 1% of the world's population. And so you have family members, Wilfred will appreciate this, you have family members who live for Jack and Jill and Alpha Kappa Alpha and Alpha Phi Alpha and Omega Psi Phi, and that's all great and wonderful. But just remember that you're only targeting your social life in half of 1% of the world's population. There's so much more out there to be discovered. I mean, so personally, I love learning about new people, new cultures. I love learning about Soviet writers, for example, who knew Soviet repression. I love learning about Hong Kong immigrants who came from nothing and acquired property in our country. I love learning about the Jewish American experience. That's just the way I am. I think it's a healthier way to be, quite frankly, if you live in a country which is composed of many people. Because if you descend into tribalism, I think the Balkans beckon. That's what I think.
Yeah, they're actually just, I guess there is one comment here. I was recently reading a book called The Washing of the Spears, which is about the war between the British and the Zulus.
Mm-hmm.
And they were talking about how both sides would just casually commit atrocities because they didn't fully view the other as human.
Mm.
And the way the back and forth wave of atrocities stopped was that one of the generals, and I don't mean to make some deep point here, but I don't even remember if it was a white or a black man. One of them just said, we need to stop doing this. And they took some prisoners and eventually let them go. And
Right.
that was the response to them the next time. And this is something that comes to mind when you think about Israel and Palestine, for example. There's a natural human inclination to pick teams. And this goes well below the level of races and these other great groups. I mean, there are many working class neighborhoods, white and black, in Chicago, where you'd be beaten half to death if you walked through wearing a green and yellow jersey with the word Packers on it.
Right.
The humans have that atavistic kind of, and you should be. I'm just kidding. But like humans have that atavistic tribal reaction to a lot of things. And it's very, very natural to us to squat off by race, by country, by state, athletic team, high school, a bunch of other things. And in reality, you can only progress to real knowledge when you get past that sort of defending what your group says. You know, sure, baseball is racist sort of nonsense, to actually looking objectively and logically at whether what people are claiming is true. And what you're going to find if you start doing that is that very often what you've believed, if you come from any real tradition, the black middle class, the Catholic Church, feminism, it's often true. Those aren't just garbage, but it's often false. It's false as often as it is true. And when you see that, when you realize that the total number of unarmed brothers killed in a typical year is 10, not 15,000, you can't refuse that truth because you've been taught it has to be false. You have to accept it as true and adjust. So that is kind of the basis of development almost as a person.
Wow. Wow. If only more Americans would heed those words. Only more Black Americans would heed those words.
All Americans, yeah.
Yes, yes.
We all could learn a lesson. Well, I know that you've got a Kentucky bourbon ale with your name on it somewhere there soon. So, uh, Wink, do you have any final questions for Wilfred before he lets him go?
I don't. I just wanted to say this has been a real pleasure. I've enjoyed this immensely. It's a real joy to always speak with an intellectual who is open-minded and is willing to challenge dogma, willing to unearth and unpackage hoax and taboos. That's great. That's much appreciated, and I'm just thrilled we had this chance to talk and meet with you.
All right, love seeing you guys too, and I'll be in touch to follow up my email with a couple questions and so on. But good, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hold My Drink. Like or subscribe to the show and check out the show notes for links to source material and to our website where you can find what each of us is reading every week, different news with different views. If you have a topic that you would like us to explore, drop us a line. And join us next week as we say hold my drink and the conversation gets real.